I've made it very clear you don't belong in this first-class area." The wooden cane hit the floor with a sharp clink. All eyes in the Langford Airport lounge seemed to focus on one person, a furious flight attendant with blonde hair and an elderly black woman standing calmly, not bowing her head, not angry. A few seconds later, in an air thick with tension, the woman, her voice deep and steady, her gaze making the entire room fall silent, said one sentence: "You've just made the biggest mistake of your career." And she was right. From one small moment of discrimination, an entire chain of events was set in motion, leading to a painful yet necessary lesson on prejudice, change, and compassion. This is not a story about an airport. It's a journey of awakening where wrongs are forgiven and trust is rebuilt from the deepest wounds. If you think kindness can't change people, watch till the end of this story. It'll make you think twice and perhaps live a little differently. If you love emotional and meaningful stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video. Now, let's begin the moving journey of Lorraine and Tracy, a chance encounter, but one full of fate. The Northbridge International Airport was engulfed in chaos. Passengers jostled, hurrying in every direction as announcements echoed throughout the space like a frantic melody. Yet, amidst all the commotion, a sudden sharp sound rang out. A wooden cane was knocked out of the hands of an elderly woman, falling to the tiled floor with a dry, crackling noise, startling those nearby. A shrill scream pierced the air. The elderly woman trembled, raising her hand to shield her face, her gray-blue eyes wide in astonishment. Before her stood a flight attendant, the nameplate on her uniform glinting under the fluorescent lights. It was Amanda Keller. Her face twisted in disgust, her eyes flashing with anger and contempt. She pointed firmly toward the boarding gate. "I was very clear that you should move aside." Amanda shouted loudly enough for everyone around to hear, "First class is not for someone like you." A heavy silence enveloped the area. Footsteps stopped, curious glances turned toward the two women, but no one dared intervene even as whispers began to spread. However, Agnes Harper, the elderly woman, did not cry out or protest. Her hand trembled slightly, but with calm composure and a steady demeanor, she slowly bent down to pick up her cane. When she stood up, her posture was poised and serene, a stark contrast to Amanda's aggression. She locked eyes with the flight attendant. That gaze held no anger. It was something much deeper, an inner peace, powerful enough to pierce the heart of the person before her. In a calm, firm voice that wasn't loud but sent a shiver down the listener's spine, Agnes spoke. "You just made a grave mistake in your career." Northbridge Airport during peak hours felt like a miniature battlefield. People rushed, footsteps hurried, and tense eyes fixed on the boarding gates. The loudspeakers rang out continuously, blending with the noise, making the air thick and suffocating. Amidst this whirlwind of chaos, one person walked with an uncanny calm. She was unaffected by the frantic pace around her. It was Lorraine Bennett, a woman of about 60. Her silver hair with strands of black neatly styled, she wore an elegant emerald green outfit holding a handcrafted wooden cane with a delicately carved handle, both a support and a symbol of her grace and dignity. Lorraine's face bore the marks of time, but her eyes were full of strength, depth, and wisdom. She didn't seek attention yet. Every step she took on the polished stone floor caused those around her to glance up. She walked slowly toward the first-class boarding area. Meanwhile, a young blonde flight attendant hurried past her in the opposite direction. her haughty gaze fixed forward, her uniform pressed perfectly. That was Tracy Morgan, known for her strict demeanor and her proper service style in the first-class cabins. While checking the passenger list in her hands, Tracy accidentally brushed against Lorraine. The collision wasn't forceful, but it caused Lorraine's cane to almost slip from her grasp. Lorraine managed to hold on to it, though her brow furrowed slightly, a natural reaction to the discomfort she suppressed. Tracy stopped, looked up, and scanned Lorraine from head to toe with disdain, her lips pressed tightly together. She looked at Lorraine as if the woman had obstructed the entire service process. "Please, move out of the way," Tracy said coldly, her piercing blue eyes sharp with judgment. "This area is reserved for first-class passengers." But Lorraine didn't budge. She simply stared back at Tracy, her gaze calm but sharp like a knife, not avoiding the confrontation. "I know exactly where I'm standing." "Thank you," Lorraine replied softly, her voice carrying a natural authority that made Tracy hesitate for a moment. Tracy furrowed her brow, clearly dissatisfied with the composure of the older woman. In Tracy's mind, a prejudice brewed, an older, simply dressed woman of color. There was no way she belonged in the elite flying class that Tracy was tasked to serve. To Tracy, Lorraine was clearly an inappropriate intrusion. The atmosphere between the two women quickly became tense. Passengers nearby began to take notice. A few stopped pulling their luggage, pretending to check their tickets or phones so they could observe the scene. Lorraine stood there silent, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. It was this calm that made Tracy feel challenged. She tightened her grip on the list in her hand, a vague discomfort rising within her. Tracy thought to herself, she couldn't let this situation end like this. Neither woman knew that this brief encounter would soon ignite a storm far beyond what either of them had imagined. Standing opposite Lorraine Bennett, an elderly woman of color, with a simple appearance, Tracy Morgan felt the deep-seated prejudices within her subconscious begin to surface. In her mind, Lorraine was not a legitimate passenger, but rather someone intentionally causing trouble, challenging the authority she believed she held. Or, at the very least, Lorraine was pretending to be naive in order to sneak into a place that wasn't meant for someone like her. It was these twisted thoughts that clouded Tracy's judgment. She took a deep breath, her green eyes narrowing, her once cold expression growing even colder. Without giving Lorraine a chance to speak further, Tracy abruptly stepped forward and yanked the ticket from Lorraine's left hand. But Lorraine quickly reacted instinctively, pulling her hand back, dodging the rough grab. This action only made Tracy lose further control. She moved forward again, her attitude growing more aggressive. And then, in a moment of uncontrolled anger, Tracy swung her hand and slapped Lorraine's knuckles. The hand that held the precious wooden cane, an item that was not only a support, but also a symbol of the woman's long-held dignity. The slap echoed sharply, reverberating through the stifling air as if a gunshot had just gone off. The cane slipped from Lorraine's hand, clattering loudly against the marble floor, sending a dry, hollow sound that startled many nearby. A few passengers turned their heads, their eyes wide in disbelief at what had just occurred. Lorraine furrowed her brow, the first sign of discomfort showing on her face. She glanced at her cherished cane, now lying cold and alone on the floor, then slowly raised her head to face Tracy. Her expression was not one of anger, but of disappointment, a disappointment deeper than any verbal rebuke. Yet, rather than showing any sign of guilt or regret, Tracy grew more frustrated when she saw Lorraine's gaze remain unshaken. She raised her voice deliberately, speaking loudly for all around to hear. "I've already made it very clear, ma'am. This area is for first-class passengers. Only. People like you don't belong here." The words hit like a second slap, not to Lorraine, but to the entire crowd. No one spoke up, but the area froze in shock and disbelief. Those words were no longer a misunderstanding or a minor clash. They carried a clear, serious tone of racial discrimination. And worse, they were uttered with chilling confidence. Some passengers began to murmur, their gazes shifting from curiosity to anger, yet no one had the courage to speak up. In the distance, a young businessman in a suit stood frozen, his eyes still fixed on Lorraine. It was Nathan Grant, who had seen her in the VIP lounge. He gripped his phone tightly, unsure of whether he should intervene. Nearby, a middle-aged, elegant woman, Catherine Blake, covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with a mix of panic and anger, looking toward Lorraine with deep sympathy. Despite the tense atmosphere, Lorraine Bennett remained unmoved. Her face showed no fear or anger. On the contrary, she observed Tracy with a cold, quiet gaze, as if every word had become redundant. But within that silence, countless questions surged through her mind. Why, in this day and age when she was a successful woman with a solid social standing, was she still facing such blatant discrimination? Lorraine's icy gaze slowly turned toward the crowd. Immediately, every eye avoided hers. She said nothing, but the silence alone made everyone feel ashamed and uneasy. As for Tracy, she felt the weight of the surrounding gazes pressing down on her. But instead of retreating, her ego and the prejudice within her grew stronger, overpowering her reason and making it impossible for her to step back. She forced herself to maintain her defiant attitude, as if doing so was the only way to protect herself from everything that was about to unravel. Neither woman knew that what seemed like a spontaneous encounter would soon trigger a chain of events that would completely alter both of their lives. In the heavy silence, Lorraine stood tall, her head held high, her posture full of pride, as if no insult could ever make her submit. She didn't speak, didn't react, just silently observed. Her arm slowly dropped, her gaze fixed on the cane lying quietly on the cold floor. The murmurs around her seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a chilling silence. Every eye was on her, waiting for some reaction. Across from her, Tracy Morgan stood frozen, her breath quickening, her face flushed with both anger and confusion. Her shiny blonde hair was slightly disheveled, her bright green eyes burning with arrogance, but deep within them was an undeniable hint of worry. She realized the strange calmness of this woman was truly what terrified her. Lorraine slowly lifted her head, staring directly into Tracy's eyes. Her eyes were deep, full of hidden strength, causing those around her to hold their breath in anticipation. Without rushing, without showing anger, Lorraine simply observed, as though she was looking at someone who had just made a grave mistake and still hadn't realized it. Finally, in the tense silence, she spoke. Her voice was soft, even, but clear enough that each word seemed to resonate throughout the space. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life, young lady." The words rang out like a warning bell amidst the silence. Everyone felt a chill run down their spine. No one fully understood the meaning behind her words, but all could sense the cold weight carried within them. They weren't threats, nor were they born of anger. Instead, they were a profound, solemn warning filled with experience and dignity. Tracy took a small step back, her heart pounding from the unnerving calm of Lorraine. However, Tracy Morgan quickly masked the worry that simmered inside her. She lifted her head high, her red lips curling into a defiant smile. "Are you threatening me?" she asked, trying to maintain a facade of confidence though her voice had started to tremble with doubt and fear. "I'm just doing my job as a flight attendant." She emphasized each word. "If you can't prove that you're eligible, please step aside." Lorraine Bennett didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slowly bent down to pick up the precious wooden cane that still lay on the cold floor. Though the action was gentle, it exuded a clear sense of dignity and self-respect. After securing the cane firmly in her grip, she stood upright, paused in silence for a few seconds, and then looked directly into Tracy's eyes. This time her gaze was no longer sharp. It was heavy with disappointment. "Threaten me," Lorraine repeated softly as though reflecting on something. "No, young lady, I don't need to threaten anyone. But perhaps you need to learn that every word, every action carries consequences that you cannot foresee." Lorraine's words caused those around them to exchange curious and confused glances. Everyone could feel that what was happening wasn't just a typical dispute. It was something much bigger. In the crowd, Nathan Grant, the young businessman nearby, quietly pulled out his phone and began recording the incident. With the intuition honed from working with high-profile individuals, he immediately understood that this wasn't an ordinary argument. And if Lorraine's true identity was revealed, it could very well turn into a serious scandal. He didn't know exactly who she was, but just by the way she stood, the way she spoke, Nathan was sharp enough to understand that Lorraine Bennett was no ordinary woman. At that moment, Tracy began to feel the pressure from the dozens of eyes fixed on her. She looked around and met gazes of surprise, anger, and scrutiny. The situation seemed to be spiraling out of control. However, her pride and deep-seated prejudices wouldn't allow her to step back. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her usual stern demeanor. "If you truly have a valid first-class ticket," she said loudly so everyone could hear, "then show it right now." "We shouldn't waste the time of the other passengers." Lorraine stared at her for a moment longer, then slowly reached into the pocket of her elegant coat. She pulled out a premium leather wallet, opened it calmly, and took out the boarding pass that had been carefully stored. Not hurriedly, not ostentatiously, she extended the ticket toward Tracy and spoke softly. "I hope you will take responsibility for what just happened. This is a first-class ticket issued by your own airline, but it seems in your eyes I'm not worthy of holding it." Tracy grabbed the ticket hastily, her eyes quickly scanning the text. When she saw the name Lorraine Bennett and the seat first class, 1A, her expression shifted from skepticism to shock. Though she didn't immediately understand the significance behind the name, her confidence began to waver. Still, Tracy tried to maintain her cold exterior, though a flicker of confusion flashed in her eyes. Lorraine remained still, her face without a hint of emotion. But it was her calmness that made Tracy and the surrounding crowd feel more uneasy than ever. In everyone's mind, one question lingered, echoing, who is this powerful woman and what awaits Tracy next? As Tracy read the information on the ticket again, an unsettling feeling rose within her, hard to describe. Time seemed to slow down, and in that moment an image from just a few hours earlier flashed vividly in her mind. Northbridge Airport was crowded then as well, but the atmosphere in the VIP lounge was entirely different. Everything there had an air of tranquility and sophistication. Soft yellow lights, luxurious leather chairs, attendants moving gracefully as if gliding through space. In that elegant setting, Lorraine Bennett sat quietly by a large window, Her eyes thoughtful as she watched the planes roll onto the runway. She wore a sapphire velvet coat, paired with a white silk blouse and a light silver scarf, simple yet exuding nobility. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly styled, the soft curls accentuating the demeanor of a woman who had lived through much but had never been defeated. Not far from her, Nathan Grant, the young businessman in a sharp gray suit, was working on his laptop. A frequent first-class flyer, Nathan was no stranger to such luxurious surroundings. But that day, he sensed something was different. His gaze drifted from his screen to the woman sitting by the window. There was something about Lorraine that he couldn't look away from, not because she was exceptionally striking, but because the tranquility and natural authority she radiated made others want to show her respect. She didn't need to try to prove anything. Just by her presence, Lorraine made it clear that she wasn't an ordinary person. As Nathan observed her with a mixture of curiosity and admiration, Tracy Morgan entered the lounge to check the first-class passenger list before the flight. Upon seeing Lorraine, she immediately froze her eyes, narrowing in suspicion. The deep-seated prejudice made her automatically assume that the woman didn't belong there. She glanced quickly at Lorraine's outfit, her gaze full of judgment. In Tracy's mind, an older woman of color dressed modestly could never afford a first-class ticket worth thousands of dollars. What bothered her even more was the way Lorraine sat there calm and collected, as if she naturally belonged in this space. Tracy Morgan quickly walked up to the service desk, lowering her voice to ask the receptionist, "Is that elderly woman sitting by the window really a first-class passenger?" The receptionist, slightly surprised by the question but still polite, answered, "Yes, Ms. Morgan. She is seated in 1A for today's flight." Tracy furrowed her brow, clearly displeased with the answer, but she said nothing further. Instead, she shot Lorraine a skeptical glance, her mind continuing to churn with biased thoughts. Blinded by her deep-seated prejudices, she failed to see the refinement in Lorraine's attire or the calm, commanding presence the older woman exuded. Before long, Tracy left the lounge with a singular thought. There must have been some mistake, or somehow the woman was exploiting privileges not meant for her. Those negative thoughts grew larger in Tracy's mind, and she quietly decided that if she got the chance, she would set things straight in her own way. Meanwhile, Nathan Grant continued to observe Lorraine quietly. He had seen the doubt in Tracy's eyes and immediately recognized that the young flight attendant was making a serious mistake. Misjudging a woman he was certain was a figure of hidden power, Nathan silently vowed that if he had the opportunity, he would learn more about this woman, her life, and the stories that must surely be extraordinary. Lorraine, seemingly unaffected by the scrutinizing gazes or Tracy's hostile stare, remained seated by the window. She had grown accustomed to such looks many years ago. Those experiences had forged the extraordinary calm that she carried with her today. At that moment, Lorraine had no idea that her presence in the lounge was not only making a deep impression on Nathan, but was also the beginning of a tense chain of events that would lead to profound change. Time passed, and the loudspeaker made an announcement. "First-class passengers, please prepare to board." Lorraine slowly stood up, adjusted her silver scarf, took her cherished cane, and walked gracefully toward the boarding gate. Nathan silently watched her retreating figure as it disappeared down the hallway, his heart filled with a mixture of curiosity and respect. He never could have imagined that just moments later, Lorraine and Tracy would create a situation so tense it would shake Northbridge Airport to its core. Since Lorraine had left the lounge and headed toward the boarding area, Tracy's unease had grown increasingly apparent. The negative thoughts in her head became more focused, fueled by the deeply ingrained prejudices and stubbornness within her. As she saw Lorraine walk with such confidence and poise, Tracy's anger flared. In her eyes, Lorraine was no longer just a passenger. She was a brazen challenge. For Tracy, this had gone beyond a personal issue. This was about her reputation and the standards she had worked so hard to maintain in the industry. She immediately moved in front of Lorraine, blocking her path. Her cold green eyes flashing with defiance, she deliberately raised her voice so that everyone around could hear. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I need to check your ticket again." Lorraine was momentarily surprised but quickly regained her composure. She opened her small leather bag, took out the neatly folded ticket, and handed it to Tracy. Without saying a word, nearby passengers began to take notice of the situation. A few exchanged curious and anxious glances, whispering among themselves in silence. Tracy stared at the ticket with a cold, skeptical expression as though she were looking for a flaw in something she knew was legitimate. She frowned, though she clearly knew this was a valid ticket. But the biases within her were stronger than her reason. She saw this as an opportunity to prove her authority, to show that she was the one in control. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" Tracy asked, her voice full of implication and disdain. Accompanied by a forced smile, Lorraine remained calm and replied gently but firmly. "As you've just seen, this is my ticket. Seat 1A for today's flight. I don't understand why such a simple matter is being dragged out like this." It was Lorraine's calm and certainty that made Tracy feel even more insulted. Rather than controlling her emotions, she continued to raise her voice, making sure that more people were paying attention. "I think something is not right here, ma'am. First-class tickets are not something just anyone can buy. We've discovered many cases of passengers using fake tickets or upgrading illegally. I will not allow that to happen today." Her words were clearly an accusation in front of the crowd, causing a stir among the onlookers. A few people turned to whisper to each other, their eyes wide with a mix of shock and sympathy toward Lorraine. But she remained as calm as ever, neither angry nor trembling. She responded with a gentle but authoritative tone. "I fully understand your responsibility. But my ticket has been clearly confirmed by the airline. I suggest you check the system before making any further baseless accusations." However, these polite words only served to further frustrate Tracy. To her, Lorraine's calmness and confidence seemed like an implicit challenge. She felt as though she was being provoked, threatened, and that only fueled her growing anger. Unable to contain herself any longer, Tracy turned to the crowd, watching, raising her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely apologize for this inconvenience, but I must make it clear that there are some passengers trying to use invalid tickets to enter the first-class area. Such deceitful behavior is completely unacceptable," Tracy Morgan declared loudly in front of everyone. The passengers around her exchanged stunned looks, unable to believe what was unfolding before them. They were shocked by the harsh, public, and prejudiced accusation coming from the flight attendant. Among them, Nathan Grant, the young businessman who had been observing Lorraine Bennett from the VIP lounge, furrowed his brow in disapproval. He could clearly see that Tracy was crossing the line and treating someone he believed to be highly respected unfairly. However, he hesitated, unsure whether he should intervene or not. Lorraine stared at Tracy with a cold, sharp gaze, but maintained her composure. She was neither angry nor engaged in a loud argument. Instead, she calmly asserted the truth, her voice deep and authoritative. "As always, I have handed you my ticket for verification. It is completely valid. If you still have doubts, I suggest you check the system immediately. Slander and defamation of a passenger's honor is a serious matter. I trust you understand that." At this, Tracy's face turned red, not from shame but from being challenged in front of the crowd. Her pride and prejudice completely overshadowed any logical thoughts. Instead of handling the situation professionally, she raised her voice even louder. "I don't need you to teach me how to do my job. I know you're trying to fool everyone here. I won't let you board this flight with a forged ticket." The atmosphere became incredibly tense. Passengers began to show signs of discomfort, many of them expressing sympathy for Lorraine, who was enduring unfair treatment that she did not deserve. A few people pulled out their phones, beginning to record the entire incident. They could clearly sense that this could turn into a major scandal. Lorraine remained still, her face as cold as ice, but radiating an unshakable calm. However, in her gaze, disappointment was starting to show, not just toward Tracy, but toward the invisible prejudice that still persisted in modern society. While Tracy allowed her anger and biases to cloud her judgment, Lorraine knew very well that this situation couldn't end here. The consequences for Tracy could be much more serious than she realized. It was Lorraine's unflinching silence that seemed to add fuel to the fire of Tracy's growing anger. Tracy's breath grew heavier, her hands trembling with the tension. Inside, she was a mix of frustration, pride, and an unwillingness to lose in front of the first-class passengers, people she had always believed only she was capable of serving and controlling. She didn't want to admit her mistake. She especially couldn't accept losing control in a situation she thought was right, and then unable to contain herself any longer. Tracy stepped forward and yanked the ticket from Lorraine's hand. The sudden move caused those around them to flinch. Lorraine raised an eyebrow, surprised but unfazed. She remained firm, her gaze on Tracy stern but still composed. At that moment, it seemed Tracy had completely lost control. Ignoring the consequences, not caring about her reputation, her face flushed red with anger, she held the ticket up in front of all the watching passengers and shouted, "If you still refuse to admit you're cheating, I won't let this fake ticket exist for another second." Before the horrified eyes of the crowd, Tracy began to tear the ticket to pieces, a cruel and unacceptable action. The sound of paper tearing rang out loudly in the still air like a warning bell, a sign that Tracy Morgan had officially crossed the final line. Shreds of paper fell to the floor, creating a scene of chaos and heavy tension that made it almost suffocating. The passengers nearby widened their eyes in disbelief at what had just happened. Many began recording video. Others whispered among themselves, their faces filled with anger and disappointment at Tracy's outrageous behavior. Among them, Nathan Grant stood frozen, his gaze filled with shock and frustration. He knew Lorraine had done nothing wrong, but his business-savvy caution kept him from acting, fearing that intervening might complicate matters further or affect his own reputation. Not far away, Catherine Blake, the elegant, middle-aged woman, watched the incident with a worried expression. Being sensitive to injustice, especially with clear signs of discrimination, Catherine felt a surge of anger rising within her. But she hesitated to speak up, fearing that even a small action could lead to unnecessary trouble. Meanwhile, Lorraine remained standing, her gaze colder than ever. She looked down at the torn ticket on the floor, then lifted her eyes directly to Tracy's. Her expression was no longer simply calm. It was a sharp warning. "Are you truly ready to take responsibility for your actions?" Young Lady Lorraine asked, her voice low, but resonating clearly as if tearing through the silence in the air. Tracy felt her throat go dry, but her pride wouldn't allow her to step back. She responded in a shaky voice still full of arrogance. "I'm just doing what's right to protect the reputation of this airline. If you want to sue, I'm ready to take responsibility." Lorraine didn't say anything more. She merely shook her head slightly, her gaze filled with deep disappointment. Disappointment from witnessing a generation still led by prejudice and blind arrogance. That silence made everyone around her feel suffocated. It wasn't a silence of submission. It was the silence of a storm about to hit. At that moment, Nathan Grant took a deep breath. He told himself he needed to do something, but his feet seemed frozen to the floor. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless in the face of such a blatant injustice. Meanwhile, Tracy Morgan still hadn't fully grasped the gravity of the action she had just taken. She tried to maintain her cold professional demeanor, but panic was beginning to show in her eyes. She understood that the situation had spiraled out of control, but there was no turning back for her now. The air around the boarding gate had thickened, growing stifling with tension. Lorraine Bennett still stood there, calm but resolute. She knew that from this moment on, Tracy had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and the consequences would not only fall on Tracy, but would also impact the airline and everyone present at Northbridge Airport that day. In the midst of the crowd's breathless silence, quick and heavy footsteps suddenly echoed from behind. A tall man in a sharp black suit walked swiftly toward the scene of the incident. It was Howard Ellis, the senior executive of the Airline, one rank just below the highest level of management. As soon as he appeared, all curious and tense, gazes immediately turned toward him. Howard had long been known as a strict, cold leader, but one who was always fair and principled. As he approached, his sharp gaze immediately swept over the torn ticket fragments on the floor and the panicked face of Tracy Morgan. With just one glance, he understood the gravity of what had happened. He turned his gaze toward Lorraine, and at that moment his stern expression softened, transforming into one of deep respect. Without a word, Howard bowed his head slightly before Lorraine, a gesture of incredible formality, something he had never done for anyone before. This act stunned both Tracy and the crowd into silence. "Mrs. Bennett," he said in a low, clear, and respectful voice, "I deeply regret what has just transpired. Please accept my sincerest apologies, both from me and from the airline, for the utterly unacceptable behavior that occurred." His words rang through the frozen atmosphere, making the crowd even more curious and astonished. But what shook them the most wasn't the apology. It was the name Bennett spoken with such reverence. At that moment, Tracy Morgan froze. The blood in her veins seemed to stop. Her heart pounded, her breath felt constricted. Anxiety and fear surged through her like a tidal wave. The unusual respect Howard Ellis showed Lorraine made Tracy realize this was no ordinary woman, as she had assumed. Her mind spun desperately, searching for a reasonable explanation for the increasingly terrifying situation. But when Howard turned to face her, his gaze was no longer one of respect. It was cold and admonishing, chilling in its severity. His voice rang out strong as thunder. "Morgan, I honestly cannot understand what you were thinking when you dared to directly insult the chairwoman and CEO of this airline, the very founder of the corporation you are serving. Mrs. Lorraine, Bennett is the one who built this brand and the reputation of this airline from its earliest days. Your thoughtless and disrespectful actions have far exceeded any limits of what is acceptable." His words echoed like a verdict. Tracy's entire body froze. Her face turned pale, Her lips trembling, unable to utter a word, she realized she had made the biggest mistake of her life, a mistake that could never be undone. Around them, passengers began to murmur their eyes, turning to Lorraine with surprise and respect. No one could have guessed that the elderly, composed, and quiet woman was the most powerful figure at the airline. Many people had pulled out their phones recording the event, realizing that they were witnessing a moment that could soon explode across the media and social networks. Nathan Grant, who had been following the entire situation, was stunned. He had suspected that Lorraine was no ordinary person, but he had never imagined she held such influence. He could only shake his head in regret for Tracy, who had allowed her biases to cloud her judgment, leading to this irreparable disaster. Tracy Morgan now stood unsteady. Every word from Howard Ellis reverberated in her head like a sentence with no way out. She turned to look at Lorraine, her eyes filled with terror and pleading, but Lorraine simply looked back at her with disappointment and sympathy. Throughout the entire incident, Lorraine Bennett maintained her composure and dignity. She showed no glee, no anger, simply a quiet strength that came from a soul well-traveled and unbroken. She gently nodded to Howard and then spoke softly but powerfully. "Thank you, Howard. I do not wish to escalate this further, but there are behaviors that we cannot accept if we are to protect the values and integrity of this airline. I think Ms. Morgan needs time to truly reflect on what transpired today." Those gentle words pushed Tracy to the depths of shame and helplessness. In that moment, she realized this was no longer a personal mistake. She had caused significant damage to the image of the airline she had once proudly worked for, the place she had believed was her lifelong career. Under the stern gaze of Howard Ellis and the silent authority of Lorraine Bennett, Tracy Morgan understood that her career in the airline industry had officially come to an end from this moment onward. But what hurt more than losing her job was the overwhelming shame and humiliation flooding her mind. The brutal truth that her own biases and blind arrogance had destroyed the future she had worked so hard to build over the years. Amidst the murmurs around her and the tense atmosphere filling the boarding area, Lorraine stood firm with her usual calm demeanor, even as her true identity had been revealed. She knew that after today, not just Tracy Morgan, but everyone who witnessed this event would learn a valuable lesson about respect and fairness values she had spent her life defending. When Lorraine's calm yet weighty words concluded, the air at the gate became more suffocating than ever. All the passengers stood in silence, whispers rising like small waves, but everyone kept their voices low. Tracy, in that moment, felt as though she was falling into an endless abyss, her eyes wide with confusion and desperation as she realized the catastrophic consequences of her actions. Howard Ellis looked at Tracy once more, his gaze cold and unhidden. Slowly, he took his phone from his jacket pocket, his voice calm yet decisive. "Captain Bradley, this is Howard Ellis. Please have Flight Attendant Tracy Morgan come to the cockpit immediately. We have a serious situation to address before takeoff." Each word from Howard pierced Tracy's mind like needles, signaling that the moment of judgment had arrived. Her mind was blank. Her heart pounded fiercely, each beat like the sound of a war drum. Moments later, an airline security officer approached, his voice polite yet firm. "Miss Morgan, please follow me to the cockpit. The captain and the deputy director are waiting for you." Tracy swallowed hard, knowing she had no choice. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stay upright, walking behind the security officer under the gaze of the other passengers whose eyes were filled with sympathy but also judgment. She walked as though on a path with no end. Every step felt like a sharp cut to her pride, forcing her to face the consequences of her own actions. When the cockpit door closed behind her, the atmosphere inside became immediately oppressive. Before her stood Captain Bradley Coleman, a man with salt and pepper hair and a sharp, piercing gaze known for his uncompromising strictness. Sitting beside him was Victor Lamont, the airline's deputy director, one of the most powerful figures known for his steadfast stance on professional ethics and fairness in personnel management. Victor looked at Tracy with cold, disappointed eyes. Without exchanging pleasantries, he spoke immediately, his voice clear and sharp as a knife. "Tracy Morgan, do you realize that your actions not only seriously violate professional ethics, but also represent an extremely severe act of racial discrimination?" The question hit Tracy like a boulder, crushing her chest and leaving her breathless. She lowered her head, avoiding Victor's harsh stare, but she couldn't escape her responsibility. Victor continued his tone, growing even more severe. "I'm waiting for an answer. Why did you humiliate and disgrace Chairman Lorraine Bennett in front of all the passengers? Why did you tear up her ticket in public when all the information was valid?" Tracy tried to regain her composure, but she completely failed. Her voice trembled as she stammered, I didn't know she was Chairman Bennett. I was just following the procedure." Victor immediately interrupted her, his voice cold as ice. "Which procedure allows you to insult and judge someone solely based on their appearance? Ms. Morgan, do you understand that your behavior is a textbook example of racial discrimination, a thing this airline will never tolerate?" His words cut deep into Tracy's heart. The air in the cockpit felt like it was closing in, suffocating her. Victor looked at her one last time, his gaze shifting from anger to pain. "I want the truth, Tracy. You need to admit that you acted this way because of racial prejudice. If you still have any self-respect, own up to it." Tears welled up in Tracy's eyes, and finally she could no longer hold back her shame and humiliation. She lowered her head, her voice choked. "I was wrong. I let my prejudice cloud my actions. I was wrong to treat Mrs. Bennett unfairly because of her appearance. I'm truly sorry." The cockpit fell into silence, but it was not the usual silence. It was the silence of deep, painful disappointment. Captain Bradley sighed. Saying nothing, but his gaze alone conveyed his utter disappointment. Victor was the one to conclude the conversation. His voice was low, clear, and firm. "Your apology is too late. Your actions have caused significant damage to the image and reputation of this airline. More importantly, you've directly insulted the founder of this airline, the person who has dedicated her life to building a fair and professional work environment." He paused for a moment, then continued with finality. "We will convene an urgent disciplinary meeting after this flight to make an official decision. But from now on, you will be indefinitely suspended. Take this time to reflect carefully on the consequences of your prejudice and the negligence you have caused." Tracy Morgan stood motionless, tears silently streaming down her face, fully aware that her career had officially ended. But more than losing her job, she understood that the painful lesson learned today would stay with her forever. A harsh reminder of the catastrophic consequences of letting prejudice and arrogance dictate her actions. When the cockpit door opened once more, Tracy stepped out with a bewildered look, her face marked with the traces of tears that had yet to dry. Inside the cabin, an eerie silence hung in the air as every passenger turned their gaze toward her, a mix of curiosity and judgment in their eyes. Tracy understood that what awaited her was not just the decision of her suspension. She had been required to do something far heavier than any administrative punishment: a public apology in front of all the passengers. In the cramped first-class cabin, Lorraine Bennett still sat calmly exuding composure and strength, completely unaffected by the harsh insult or the gazes that were now fixed on her. She didn't show any signs of triumph or gloating at the sight of Tracy walking toward her face, flushed with shame. Lorraine's gaze remained calm, profound, yet heavy with significance. Howard Ellis stood beside her, his expression stern and resolute. It was he who had demanded that Tracy publicly apologize as a deterrent to all airline staff that racial discrimination would not be tolerated here. Tracy took each step with the weight of the world on her shoulders. She inhaled deeply, gathering her last bits of courage to face Lorraine's stern eyes and the heavy glances of the passengers around her. The gazes that followed her made her heart race, but she knew there was no turning back. She lowered her head, her voice trembling and catching in her throat, but she tried to speak clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Mrs. Bennett, I apologize for what happened. I acted disrespectfully and insulted you greatly. I let my prejudice cloud my judgment, and that was a grave mistake. Please accept my sincere apology." Her words rang out clearly in the deafening silence, but the response she received was a cold silence from Lorraine. It wasn't forgiveness, nor was it silence to easily overlook the matter. It was the silence of someone who had endured much injustice, but had never lost their dignity. Lorraine slowly lifted her head, her gaze sharp as a knife directed at Tracy. Then spoke her voice soft, yet filled with authority. Each word clear and deliberate. "I accept your apology, Tracy. But I have one question, and I want you to think carefully to answer honestly. Right here in front of everyone." The air immediately became suffocating. Every passenger held their breath, sensing that the question about to be asked would reveal a truth many often try to avoid. Lorraine continued her gaze still fixed on Tracy, her voice deep and very clear. "If today I were just an ordinary woman of color, not the chairwoman or CEO without power or fame, would you still be standing here apologizing to me?" Her question struck Tracy like a lightning bolt, rendering her speechless. Whispers immediately spread throughout the first-class cabin. Passengers turned to look at each other, their eyes filled with deep contemplation. That question was like a mirror reflecting a painful truth that no one wanted to face. The truth about the bias hidden deep within every person. Tracy stood frozen, her mouth open as if to speak, but she couldn't find the words. Lorraine's question exposed everything she had tried to hide, that if Lorraine had only been an ordinary elderly woman, Tracy would never have been forced to face her mistake. All strength seemed to drain from Tracy's body. She lowered her head deeply, her shame radiating through every gesture, every facial expression. She couldn't say anything more. All she could do was endure the humiliation she had brought upon herself. Sebastian Wells and Vivian Clark, two passengers who had witnessed the entire ordeal from the beginning, no longer felt curiosity or anger. Instead, they shared a deep understanding and a strong emotional response to the lesson Lorraine Bennett had just delivered not only to Tracy, but to everyone on this flight. The atmosphere gradually relaxed, but Lorraine's question still echoed in everyone's mind. She looked at Tracy once more, her gaze no longer cold, but softened, tinged with a bit of sadness, yet still filled with firmness. "Tracy, I hope that after today you will truly understand that respect and dignity cannot be judged by outward appearance or social status. We must treat everyone fairly and with respect no matter who they are, where they come from, or what color their skin is." Tracy nodded faintly, tears silently falling again, but this time they were tears of realization of true remorse. Lorraine's final words were not just advice. They were a living message, a strong reminder of fairness, kindness, and the heartbreaking consequences of unconscious bias. The entire cabin still carried the weight of the tension, like the lingering aftermath of an emotional storm that had not yet fully dissipated. It seemed as though everything had ended with the public apology and that chilling question. But Howard Ellis, the highest-ranking supervisor on the flight, unexpectedly made a decision that left the entire crew stunned. Tracy Morgan would continue her duties, but not as before. She would serve Lorraine Bennett throughout the flight as a symbolic punishment and a stern warning about the consequences of racial discrimination. The first-class cabin buzzed with murmurs. A few passengers exchanged looks of satisfaction, not because they wanted to humiliate anyone, but because justice had been served in a deeply humane way. The other passengers remained silent, but their eyes betrayed their curiosity. Everyone was eager to witness the dramatic reversal of roles. Tracy Morgan didn't say a word, only lowered her head silently as she accepted her task. Inside her, it felt as though something was cracking. Not just the shame, but a belated realization about the blind belief she had carried for so many years. She slowly turned back toward the first-class cabin, where Lorraine Bennett still sat as immovable as a statue, exuding a calm, resolute presence, as if no storm could touch her. "Is there anything I can get for you, Mrs. Bennett?" Tracy asked, her voice dry but trying to remain composed. Lorraine looked up, her gaze neither resentful nor cold, only quiet, tinged with a distant sadness. She nodded gently. Black tea, no sugar, and a few slices of fresh lemon. Tracy nodded, turned, and walked away. Behind her, the eyes of passengers like Sebastian Wells, Vivian Clark, and many others followed her every step, making each move feel like an additional weight on her shattered self-respect. In her 10 years as a flight attendant, Tracy had never felt so alienated from her own uniform. When she returned with the tray of tea in hand, Tracy lowered her head and carefully placed it in front of Lorraine. Each movement was slow, almost too deliberate, like she was performing a ritual. Not just doing a simple task, Lorraine took the tea, placing it gently on the table, her eyes never leaving Tracy. "Have you ever served anyone like this before?" she asked, her voice as light as a breeze. Tracy hesitated for a moment before responding quietly. "No. Never." Lorraine continued, not waiting for an answer. "Do you remember how you felt when you saw me walk into the VIP lounge earlier? The suspicion, the discomfort, people often call that instinct, but really it's prejudice, an old reflex nurtured by skewed perceptions." Tracy remained silent. Lorraine's words, though not accusatory, cut deeply into the thin shell she had built to hide her regret. Lorraine took a sip of tea, then turned her gaze to the window where the white clouds drifted beneath the plane's wing. "Fortunately, you're not the first person to think that I don't belong here, and you won't be the last. But I hope that today you'll be one of the few who dares to face your mistakes and change because of it." Those words weren't just for Tracy. They echoed in the hearts of all the passengers, those who had been silently watching the unspoken exchange between two women. One who had been insulted because of her skin color, and one who had used her small power to judge another. Tracy continued to serve Lorraine for the rest of the flight. No longer the head flight attendant, but more like an intern. She had to bring each meal, adjust the pillows and blankets, and listen to every request from Lorraine with absolute respect. Not because Lorraine was the CEO, but because she was a human being. A human being that Tracy had previously tried to dismiss simply because she didn't fit the image Tracy had of someone worthy. The passengers around them whispered, exchanging looks filled with meaning. No one applauded. No one spoke aloud, but everyone had been awakened. Each of them had at some point unwittingly overlooked an unfair glance, sighed or turned away, when witnessing an injustice, thinking that it didn't concern them. Vivian Clark, the blonde lawyer seated in 4B, tilted her head and whispered to Sebastian, "I've never seen a punishment so gentle yet so heavy." Sebastian nodded, his eyes still fixed on Lorraine. "She doesn't need to say much. Her presence is the lesson." The flight continued, but the atmosphere in the cabin had completely changed. No longer was there the usual luxury mixed with the suffocating tension of prejudice. Instead, there was a quiet but intense awakening, a living lesson on how people should treat each other. Everyone seemed lost in their own thoughts, things they usually avoided in everyday life and in that vast sky where one can often feel small. Tracy Morgan was facing the biggest challenge of her life herself, Lorraine Bennett. The woman Tracy had once looked down on had now become the center of first class, not through power or wealth, but through her calm demeanor, sharp intellect, and admirable kindness. It was this composure that created an immense pressure that Tracy could not escape. When Tracy bent down to adjust the pillow behind Lorraine's voice came softly like a passing breeze, but it rang in Tracy's mind like the sound of a bell. "Have you ever had your ability doubted, simply because of the color of your skin?" Tracy flinched. That question didn't carry any accusation, no anger, no sarcasm. It was just a simple question, but it pierced through the invisible armor Tracy had tried to wrap around herself to hide from who she truly was. She stood still for a few seconds, her hands clenched behind her, struggling to contain the choking feeling in her chest. "No," she croaked. I've never been doubted because I'm white." Lorraine didn't say anything right away. She just nodded gently, as if she already knew the answer, but her gaze, both tender and stern, made Tracy feel smaller than she ever had before. "So you've had a life that many only dare to dream of." Lorraine continued, her eyes still gazing out the window at the drifting clouds which seemed like fragmented memories. "You can walk into a VIP lounge without anyone questioning you. You are trusted without having to prove anything. You can make mistakes, and no one uses that as an excuse to judge an entire community." A lump rose in Tracy's throat. Those words, without a single reproach, hurt more than any criticism could have. In her mind, a film reel played in reverse times. She'd furrowed her brow when, seeing a person of color seated in first-class times, she had silently called security, just because a black boy accidentally stepped into the business-class area. Times she had sighed in frustration when serving someone not dressed in designer clothes. Everything became clear like an invisible indictment. And then the clearest image appeared in Tracy's mind, the look in Lorraine Bennett's eyes when she had accidentally slapped her hand. It wasn't anger in her gaze, it was pain. Like the injury Lorraine had suffered wasn't the insult, but the fact that old wounds were being repeated in a new form. Tracy Morgan turned away, unable to bear that gaze any longer. She walked quickly toward the galley where only the hum of the plane's engines filled the silence. Leaning against the food storage, her shoulders shook. She didn't cry out loud, didn't sob, Only silent tears fell like a long-awaited release when a person sees themselves for the first time, not through a mirror, but through the gaze of another. When she returned, Lorraine was still there, calm as if nothing had happened. Tracy bent down, carefully placing the fruit tray on the table. Then, suddenly, she spoke, her voice, barely a whisper, like a confession. "I'm sorry for everything. Not just for what happened today, but for all the things I thought, all the things I did." Without realizing, Lorraine looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded slightly. Not forgiveness, but recognition. Change begins with awareness. Tracy and pain is the first price we must pay. The air between the two women was no longer a battlefield. It was a moment of understanding. The entire first-class cabin remained silent, but everyone felt it as if they were witnessing a soul breaking, then being reborn. Across from them, Sebastian. Wells quietly wrote a line in his small notebook. "There are lessons that cannot be taught with words. They can only be etched deeply through wounds where pride is pierced by truth." The flight continued across the calm sky, but within the hearts of those present a storm was gradually subsiding, and after that storm, faint rays of awakening began to shine. All of this began with one seemingly simple question. Have you ever had your abilities doubted simply because of the color of your skin? The question wasn't just for Tracy, but for everyone who ever thought they were different, and forgot that the only difference that truly matters is whether the heart has learned how to empathize. When the plane's wheels touched the ground, the sense of relief hadn't yet spread before a heavy atmosphere immediately enveloped them. Tracy Morgan didn't need anyone to remind her. She knew exactly what awaited her after the airport doors. Instead of heading straight to the rest area as usual, she was escorted by 2 security personnel to a separate room, one reserved only for the most serious incidents in the airline's history. The brass plaque on the door read Strategic Meeting Room, Executive Board. A place no flight attendant ever wanted to set foot in unless it was to receive a commendation. Inside the small sealed room, the harsh, white fluorescent light illuminated a long table surrounded by waiting faces. At the head of the table sat James Whitaker, the CEO famous for his cold demeanor and no-tolerance policies. He flipped through the thick file titled Flight 934 Incident, Report of Severe Racial Discrimination. Next to him was Stephen Caldwell, the Executive Vice President, the same man who had confronted Tracy in the cockpit. But today, his gaze was no longer angry. It was quietly disappointed. Sharper than any reprimand, Tracy stood there, her uniform wrinkled from the long flight, her hair hastily tied to one side, her hands clasped tightly in front of her waist, as if trying to hold on to the last bit of courage. There were no passenger seats to hide behind, no head flight attendant badge to cover up her small power. There was only a woman, stripped bare, facing the consequences of her own actions. James Whitaker spoke, his voice as calm as a surgeon's scalpel. "Miss Morgan, we've collected full testimony from passengers' video footage from first class and reports from the crew. Do you have anything to say before the board makes its decision on your discipline?" The room fell silent. Tracy took a deep breath, her voice no longer trembling like before. "I admit that everything that happened on that flight was my fault. I acted without control, without respect for the passengers. Worse, I let my prejudice about skin color guide my actions." A brief moment of shock passed over a few faces in the room. An employee openly admitting racial discrimination before top-level executives was unprecedented, not just in the company but across the entire airline industry. No one forced Tracy to speak. There was no lawyer by her side, but she spoke anyway, almost as if she needed to hear that truth spoken aloud to stop denying it to herself. Stephen Caldwell nodded slowly, as if he had finally heard what he had hoped she would confront. "Do you understand the consequences of your actions?" he asked, his voice low. Tracy answered immediately, without hesitation. "I understand, and I'm ready to accept any form of discipline up to termination. But let me say one more thing." James gestured for her to continue. Tracy swallowed hard, looking up at the board. In her eyes was an unmistakable remorse. "I thought I was a good person. Polite, hard-working, never hurting anyone. But I didn't realize that sometimes evil doesn't have to shout or strike. It exists in the glance that avoids eye contact, in doubting someone simply because of their skin color. And when I slapped Lorraine Bennett's hand, I didn't just hurt her, I tarnished an entire system." No one spoke, but the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift. Still stern, but no longer a cold courtroom. It was a place where a person faced the ugliest parts of themselves and began to open the first door to redemption. After a minute of silence, James Whitaker closed the file, his hands clasped in front of him. "The disciplinary board will meet within 24 hours. For now, you are suspended without pay, and your flight privileges will be revoked." Tracy Morgan stood motionless, her eyes filled with tears that spoke of something deeper than just remorse. For the first time, she understood that the hardest lesson wasn't about losing her job. It was about confronting her own prejudices, realizing the deep scars they had left, and the long path she would have to walk to redeem herself. As she walked out of the meeting room, the heavy door shutting behind her, she felt the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. The journey ahead was not just about repairing the damage she had caused. It was about learning to see the world through unclouded eyes, without the filters of bias that had once governed her actions. Just 10 minutes later, the door to the meeting room opened once more. But this time it wasn't an investigator or internal manager who entered. It was Lorraine Bennett, calm, her silver hair neatly tied up, wearing a tasteful gray suit that accentuated her dignified figure, and the sound of her polished black shoes clicking authoritatively on the wooden floor. The already tense atmosphere in the room grew even heavier, filled with an almost tangible presence. Everyone, including James Whitaker, stood up as she entered. Lorraine nodded slightly, her gaze neither angry nor hurt, but filled with cold determination, as if she wasn't there to end a crisis, but to begin a new chapter. "I would like to speak to the board." Her voice rang out warm and decisive, not a hint of hesitation or anger. "I know you are waiting for a final disciplinary decision regarding Miss Morgan, and I could easily let things follow the usual internal procedures. But I believe that this incident cannot be seen as just a personal mistake." The air in the room grew heavier still. Everyone thought Lorraine would ask for the harshest punishment, perhaps immediate termination. No one dared to interrupt, but what happened next left everyone stunned. "I do not recommend firing Tracy Morgan." Her voice was slow but firm. James furrowed his brow. Stephen Caldwell's eyes widened. A few advisors bowed their heads, staring at the files in front of them as if they couldn't believe their ears. But Lorraine stood in the middle of the room, composed as if this decision had been carefully thought out beforehand. Firing someone for racial discrimination may sound fair, but it would make us overlook something more important: the opportunity to change, the opportunity to atone. Tracy is not the first person to lose professionalism because of prejudice, and sadly, she won't be the last. But if we don't start with her, then when will we begin? She turned to Stephen. I propose that instead of firing, we apply a combination of disciplinary action and rigorous retraining, a 6-month program on cultural awareness, inclusive behavior, the history of racial discrimination, and methods to eliminate personal bias. During this period, Tracy will not be allowed to participate in any commercial flights. Each stage of training will be reported directly to me. She turned to James. I also propose the establishment of an ethics and professional conduct review board with the authority not just to handle incidents, but to transform employees from the root. Tracy will be the first case. The room fell silent for a few seconds. Stephen was the first to speak, still skeptical. Mrs. Bennett, are you sure this decision won't be misunderstood as being too lenient? After all, you are the one who was wronged. Lorraine answered, her gaze as sharp as a blade. I don't need sympathy or revenge, Stephen. I need to see a better system after each misstep. Firing someone doesn't make us a better airline. It only teaches people like Tracy to hide their mistakes until they explode somewhere else. I want to change that. Tracy was called back into the meeting room. As she entered, her face was still marked with bewilderment, as if she couldn't believe anything good could come out of this. Lorraine walked straight to her, no intermediaries. Her voice softened, but her gaze still fixed on Tracy. I have recommended to the board not to fire you. Not because I forgive you, but because I want to place you before a challenge far more difficult, real change. You will undergo 6 months of intensive training. You must prove that you can be part of a future one where there is no place for racial discrimination in this industry. And if you fail, there will be no second chances. Tracy stood still. Tears welled up, not because she was spared, but because for the first time in her life she understood what it meant to be trusted when she didn't deserve it. She bowed deeply before Lorraine, her voice trembling. I know I don't deserve your help, but I won't let you down. Lorraine nodded gently. I don't need thanks. I need you to overcome yourself. At that moment, the silence in the room was no longer one of pressure. It was the beginning, an opportunity, a transformation. Not easy, but necessary. Tracy Morgan, who had once allowed prejudice to cloud her conscience, now stood at a crossroads in her life with a map she would have to learn to redraw herself. The atmosphere in the room gradually softened after the board concluded the meeting. One by one, the leadership members left, leaving only Lorraine and Tracy standing in the eerily quiet room. There were no more prying eyes, no more reports or the sound of keyboards tapping, just 2 women standing at opposite ends of a mistake facing each other in silence. Lorraine sat down in the chair by the window, where the late afternoon light filtered through the frosted glass. She didn't gesture, didn't point, didn't impose. She simply sat there as if waiting for something from a truly open heart. Tracy Morgan almost instinctively pulled the chair to sit across from Lorraine. Her back was rigid, her hands tightly clasped together. Lorraine Bennett looked at her for a long time as if contemplating where to begin. Then, with the deep and warm voice that had become her hallmark over the years in the airline industry, she spoke. You know, Tracy, when you ripped the ticket from my hand and tore it right in front of everyone, I wasn't angry. I was tired, so tired I just wanted to turn away. Tracy swallowed hard, her gaze avoiding Lorraine's eyes as though each word was striking at the most vulnerable part of her. It was the shame that no apology could erase. Lorraine continued, her voice still calm without a hint of resentment, just raw truth. But then I remembered the first time I was denied boarding. Even though I had the ticket in my hand, I was very young. Then I worked twice as hard as anyone else to afford that ticket. It was just economy class, nothing special. But I had dreamed of that trip for months. I stood there hearing them say, "Your name is not in the system," even though I had the printed ticket and the confirmation code. But just because I was a black girl wearing an old outfit standing alone amidst a crowd of white passengers, they called security and asked me to leave. Tracy blinked, a silent tear sliding down her cheek, which she didn't bother to wipe away. "I'm not telling you this for your sympathy. Tracy, I'm telling you. So you understand, today isn't the first time, and I'm not the first one. There are millions of people who have and still are going through this in silence. No one defends them. No one stands up." Lorraine leaned back, her eyes holding the experience of a lifetime as she looked directly at Tracy. "If today I were just an ordinary black woman with no title, no power, would you have apologized to me?" Tracy nodded as if confessing before an invisible court. "Yes, I don't know how I became the person I was. I thought I was raised properly. I thought I was fair. But that moment I saw you and you didn't look like the passengers I usually served, and I let prejudice lead the way." Lorraine raised an eyebrow, her voice suddenly sharp, not to scold but to tear away the last remnants of Tracy's defensive shell. Many people think they were raised properly, yet still hurt others. The issue is, if you weren't the one being judged by your skin color every day, you'd never understand how that pain seeps into a person's life. "Do you know why I didn't fire you?" Tracy shook her head, her mascara smudged. Lorraine leaned forward, her gaze fixed firmly on Tracy's face. "Because revenge is the easiest path. But change takes courage. I don't need you to disappear from this airline. I need you to face yourself. Learn from the beginning and use your own experience to stop others from becoming the next Tracy Morgan." Silence filled the room, but it was no longer tension. It was an awakening. Tracy trembled not just from shame, but because for the first time in her life, her heart began to move. Not out of fear, but because of the weight of a great compassion she hadn't thought she deserved. "I promise I won't let this opportunity be meaningless," she whispered like a vow to herself. Lorraine stood up, saying nothing more. As she left the room, she left behind a woman sitting amid the wreckage of the prejudices Tracy had once believed to be normal, and now had to rebuild piece by piece. The door closed softly but firmly. No need for declarations. No need for justifications. She had planted a seed not in an organization, but in a person, and sometimes that's where every real revolution begins. The door to the boardroom closed behind Lorraine Bennett, leaving Tracy Morgan alone in the empty meeting room. The late afternoon light filtered through the thick glass, casting a quiet stillness in the room, allowing Tracy to hear every shuddering breath she took. But in that silence, something was changing. Not on the outside, but deep within her. She no longer cried. The tears had stopped falling, replaced by a heavy feeling, no longer just shame, but responsibility. A truth was sinking in with every breath, every heartbeat. She had lived in a world where prejudice was disguised behind the veil of rules and procedures. And Lorraine, with her chilling composure and unexpected compassion, had torn that veil apart with just a look, a few words, and a refusal to retaliate. The next morning, Tracy arrived early, before the Bias Awareness Training Center even opened its doors. She wore simple clothes, no makeup, no social smile she used to wear when walking through first class with a coffee in hand. She stood before the door as if standing at the crossroads of her life. And indeed, it was. No more flight attendant uniform, no more shiny name tag, no more neatly packed suitcase behind her, like the image she once desperately tried to preserve. Only a person carrying the baggage of mistakes and the desire to change. Inside the classroom, a middle-aged Asian man with a smile in his eyes and a voice as soft as a breath nodded to greet her. Welcome to the journey of discovering yourself. Here we all carried a distorted mirror. Our task is to clean it so we can see ourselves and others more clearly. Tracy remained silent. His words were not just the opening of a training session, they were a hand reaching out from a world she had once turned her back on. In the weeks that followed, Tracy underwent challenging lessons. Some days she faced herself through video clips, reenacted situations and analyses of the hidden prejudices she had once thought were just distant theories. She listened to stories of passengers who were denied boarding, not because of their tickets, but because of their skin color. And each story, like peeling away layers of her own skin, helped her begin to understand from deep within what she had never truly seen before. She saw charts clearly illustrating how opportunities for careers, housing, and education had been stripped away by a system of racial discrimination that operated silently like an invisible machine. And the most important thing, she had to listen and be forced to listen to those who were once like Lorraine but had no power to receive a public apology. She did not resist. She listened, took notes, and relearned from scratch like a child. 6 months later, Tracy Morgan returned to the airline headquarters. This time, not to receive a promotion or praise, but to present her progress report before Lorraine Bennett and the leadership board. In that meeting, Tracy was no longer the woman who had yelled at an elderly black woman at the airport. She was someone who knew when to be silent, when to observe, and when to ask questions instead of making conclusions. More importantly, she knew humility and accepted the mistakes of her past. Lorraine read the report, flipping through each page with an unreadable, deep gaze. Finally, she looked up her eyes, meeting Tracy's. "Do you think you've changed?" Tracy took a deep breath. The question was not just a test. It was her final opportunity to be honest or to continue hiding. "I don't think I've changed enough. I just think I've started to see things I used to deliberately ignore." "And I won't stop here," Lorraine nodded slowly, a small smile appearing on her lips. "That's enough for today, but not enough for life. Keep going." That afternoon, under the thin sunlight streaming through the airport terminal, Tracy Morgan stood before a group of young flight attendants. This was their first training session. This time, she wasn't standing as a senior supervisor, but as a guide in cultural service and prejudice prevention. Remember her voice, calm and steady. Every passenger boarding the plane doesn't just bring luggage. They bring stories, invisible scars. Never be the one to make them feel like they don't belong here. The young eyes looked at her with great respect, and Tracy Morgan knew she was no longer the same person. The story ended, not with revenge, but with an opportunity and the rebirth of a soul that had once lost its way. In a world still filled with so much injustice, perhaps the strongest thing isn't the power to punish, but the compassion to give someone the chance to change. Lorraine Bennett did that, and Tracy, who was once the wrongdoer, had begun another journey, a journey to become a kinder person. Day by day, one choice after another, every word, every action, and sometimes that alone is enough to make the world a little better. When the door to the meeting room closed behind Lorraine, The flight attendant from years ago, Tracy Morgan, sat in silence in the empty room. She no longer cried. She no longer felt angry. She no longer made excuses for herself, because at that moment, shame had been replaced by something deeper: responsibility. For her whole life, Tracy had believed that she was someone who knew the right thing to do. Polite didn't harm anyone. But then one unconscious action, one swing of her hand full of prejudice, exposed something else. That evil sometimes doesn't come in the form of harsh words, but in the silence when you should stand up. And Lorraine, the woman who had been insulted that day, chose not to seek revenge. She chose to give Tracy an opportunity, not because she deserved it, but because sometimes forgiveness is the bravest act. 6 months later, Tracy stood before her first class of new flight attendants. She was no longer the person who looked down on passengers because of their skin color. She was the one who told them every passenger boarding the plane not only carries luggage, but also carries wounds. Don't be the one who makes them feel they don't belong here. You know what? No one is born perfect. No one is exempt from carrying invisible biases, no matter how small. But the story of Lorraine and Tracy shows us what defines a person is not the mistakes they make, but how they face and overcome those mistakes. True strength is not found in power, position, or appearance. True strength is in the willingness to forgive and to change, even if it means shattering the old version of yourself and rebuilding it piece by piece. What would you do if you were Lorraine? Could you give someone who wronged you a chance to make things right? Or would you close the door forever? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly value every perspective because you are an important part of this journey to spread empathy. If this story has touched you, like the video, share to spread positivity, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next heartfelt stories. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. See you in the next frames, where emotions always guide the way.